Amy, what first interested you in bringing together a collection of narratives by people with genetic mutations or people with genetically high dispositions for certain conditions?
So I started working on a memoir about my family's experience with BRCA1, which is sometimes called the breast cancer gene, in about 2005, 2006. And I really tunneled in and spent several years working on what it had been like for my family, living with a very strong predisposition for what at first we believed was initially just ovarian cancer, and then we learned after the discovery of the BRCA mutation and unfortunately my mother's experience with breast cancer, which ultimately proved to be terminal. I felt that I wanted to learn as much as I could about the BRCA mutation and to write about it. And when I finished the book, it was published by Penguin in 2010, I started giving talks and meeting with people who were also BRCA mutation positive and learning more about their lives. And I found myself increasingly curious about what's it like for other people, especially because I was receiving letters, and the letters were very moving, or emails. The emails were very moving, but they were from people not always with BRCA mutations. They were people who had something else. My memoir is called What We Have, and I was discovering that other people have other things. And that what interested me especially was what happened when there was a very strong genetic predisposition and how much that shaped an individual, a family, a culture around that person. So I found myself in 2010, 2011, thinking about what would happen if we could bring together deeply personal narratives. These are not scholarly or critical pieces, but deeply personal narratives in which people ruminated on the big issues for them. And I was especially interested in the debates or the flashpoints. Where do we differ? What are how do we become a kind of culture? Is there a kind of culture of pre-knowledge? But also, where are the variances, and how do people conceive of these issues differently? So I was fortunate. I got a grant from the Howard Foundation at Brown, and I had leave in 2011 and 12. And I immersed myself. I read as deeply as I could. I read a ton of memoirs. And I started reaching out to people and having conversations. So in a way, I've been talking with the contributors to this volume since 2011. It's been over 2 years. And I feel some of them I've gotten to know so well that they almost feel like they become members of this, of a kind of new family. There's a wide range. We have the youngest member to the anthology is in her early 20s. Some of the older members are closer to 70. There are people who have been living with knowledge about the significant condition or illness in their family for decades, and others have just found out. Some have found out when they had a child affected by a condition that they didn't know they were susceptible to. Others do not have children. So I've discovered that there are a number of kind of commonalities, and there's also some really fascinating differences. I think we all felt, several of us who are in the collection work on narrative, and narrative was this kind of strong central point to this. There is one geneticist in the mix, Misha Angris from Duke, but most of us are writers. Most of us are people who work with narrative, who think about not only what we have, but how is that having expressed in narrative form? What does it mean to talk about this, to write about this, to think about this in kind of narrative forms? And we discovered that there is no one template. We have people who have a sense that living with this mutation, whatever mutation they have or whatever precondition, has actually become so shaping and central a part of who they are that they would not give it up. It really has defined them in ways that they see as hugely positive. Others who feel that it's been debilitating and profoundly painful. So I think I've been, now that the project is out in the world, newly out in the world, and I'm coming to it again as a reader, I appreciate more and more the complexities of the ways in which we come together and the differences among us, which I think are really important to emphasize.
Tell me about the narratives. What have people faced? How has this impacted them? How have they coped?
So I organized the collection into 3 sections, and the sections I think of as strands in a braid in a way because they're all deeply involved with each other. The first section has to do with finding out. For many of these conditions, there are now genetic tests available. Do you want to be tested? In some cases, contributors have been tested, but they haven't yet found out the results. If you've learned the results, when do you want to know? Do you want to share them with people? At what time? And what about other family members? And how has that changed cultures inside of families? So that's one strand of the narrative, as people sort of confronting what we talk about as finding out. The second strand, intervening. What do you do about it? You find out, you've got something, you decide you want to know about it. What do you do about it? And those strands and those narratives, I think, point to the fact that doing something is conceived of really differently by different people. So in the simplest sense, is there a clinical intervention? But even there, some of our writers have had really troubling experiences with clinical intervention. Michael Downing, who writes about his family's experience with hereditary enlargement of the heart, actually found that the intervention almost killed him. And he had multiple infections, issues with the device that was installed. And he believes really strongly that there's a kind of narrative, a prevailing narrative about fixing or repair, which is something that our culture really believes in, right? There's something wrong with you, go in and fix it. He believes that that narrative is really troubling and that we have to resist that narrative. Other writers think about intervention aesthetically. Do I write about this, and how does the writing help? Spiritually, philosophically, do I kind of rethink what it means to be part of a community? Do I reach out to others? Do I become a kind of unwitting activist? And I think a number of the writers in this collection have become activists without necessarily wishing to or meaning to, often on behalf of children. And that's the third section, is passing down. What does this mean? In several instances, writers learn that they or their families have this mutation only when it exhibited itself in their children. So for Claire Dunsford, for example, who learned about Fragile X when her son, JP, exhibited this, and is now learning that there's a kind of dynamic movement back and forth with this mutation. What does that mean? How does that affect the way we think about time? How does it affect the way we think about ourselves through the next generation and then backwards again, because sometimes that changes how we see ourselves. So the narratives, as people think about what those narratives are, many writers were struck by the fact that the narratives are changing, that there's not a single template for how they feel about this. So Alice Wexler, whose family has been instrumental in discovering the gene for Huntington's, writes about, she's a historian, and she's interested in historical paradigms and how those have shifted over time. And she looks back across her family's life to think, well, how did we used to conceive of this? And how did we think about this in the 80s and 90s? And how did we think about this after the mapping of the genome? And how are we thinking about this now in 2013 as what we thought mapping the genome might reveal has proven to give us surprises, to make us think about things in different ways. We're not as finite and as bounded in terms of our genetic material. We are, complex. We sometimes carry material inside of us literally that is a virus or comes from elsewhere. One of our contributors actually, Isabel Stenzel-Burns, who has cystic fibrosis and has actually had lung transplants, has written really movingly about what it's like to have part of your body be someone else's organ, and how does that change the notion of how you're bounded and what it is that constitutes one's own DNA. So I think the myth that we are simple genetic beings with these kind of outlines around us, so there's sort of me, not me, that's being challenged. It's being challenged in genetics. There was a fascinating New York Times article that Michael Downing alerted me to in September of this year about the fact that we may have more than one genome inside of ourselves. And we know about junk DNA and about the complexities of what it is that's inside of ourselves. But I think from the narrative perspective, which is my interest and my sort of area of where I come into all of this, in terms of narrative, we are complex. We don't have single narratives for thinking about fear or risk or the future or legacy. We often have, and I wrote about that in the essay I contributed to the volume, about the fact that in my family I talk about what I call, the sort of family 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 moving forward, and we had shaping narratives that had to do with fatalism and determinism as much as scientific intervention, and those became shaping myths in my family, but they've been shed and replaced by new shaping myths, and yet the residue of the older narratives persist.
You spoke earlier about similarities and differences among these narratives. Were you surprised at all about such similarities and differences among this fairly disparate group of writers?
One of the things that stood out for me was the emphasis on stigma and shame across a very disparate group of individuals, men and women, academics and writers, young people and more seasoned people among us. So those of us perhaps in the volume who are middle-aged or older may have grown up with really significant layers of shame or stigma around conditions as varied as hereditary schizophrenia, the part of Patrick Tracy, to muscular dystrophy. Christine O'Hagan writes about this, to Huntington's, to hereditary cancers. And I think Claire Dunsford has been particularly articulate about the way in which that sense of shame or guilt or secrecy becomes a second form of having. So I often talk with my students about, they'll ask me, well, what made you decide to write about this? And I'll tell them honestly, when I started writing the memoir, I don't know. My training is in 17th century British literature, and I was happily writing and working on material very comfortably distant from my own life. I don't know if it's that my daughters, who are now 21 and 19, were coming into adolescence, and I began to watch them grow, and the pressures of thinking about how the next generation would confront these issues became more real to me. I don't know if that was part of it. But I do know that what I tell my students is I think that there is a kind of double deciding for me. The first decision was what happened clinically when I decided to have prophylactic surgeries, which I did in my 30s. I actually decided against genetic testing at that time because it was still so new. But that was the first decision, was a clinical decision. But to me, the second decision, the second kind of deciding, was about writing and kind of coming out about this. And for each of the writers in the volume, I think that the act of writing and disclosing and speaking publicly is a really profound part of thinking about intervention. Some of us are educators. Several of us are either affiliated with universities or are actively teaching. But that's the minority of the people in this collection. I would say the majority are involved with writing, either full-time or as a kind of central part of how they see their calling in the world. And all of us, I would say all of us, feel that whether we are full-time writers or actively think of ourselves as writers, believe that writing about this issue of living with a mutation or having a child living with a genetic inherited condition or disease, the writing is a critical part of outreach, of shedding some of that shame or stigma, of wanting there to be a wider conversation. So Misha Angrist has said, we need this. He's a geneticist and works at Duke, and he says we need this to be just another data point. We need to demystify this. We need to stop having this obsession about privacy and worry so much about what that means. But one of the writers has asked Misha, can that be simple if you're living with a condition like Huntington's or BRCA for that matter? Will that not have an impact on how you think about who you tell in terms of relationships, in terms of employers? One of our contributors, Kelly Kupo, has a marvelous essay in which she situates it. She's writing about her junior year abroad. She had been traveling for the spring break, and the volcano in Iceland has erupted, and she finds herself stranded, both literally because she's got to get back to England where she's studying and can't, but also in a kind of metaphorical way. And she ends up in a bar with a group of guys, and they're talking about how do you choose a mate? How do you choose a partner? Which is, when you're 20, 21, it's kind of one of the central mysteries of life is how do you ever know and how does that ever happen? Maybe that stays a central mystery of life, I don't know, but it's certainly a mystery of life then. And these guys start talking. They have no way of knowing, as she puts it, what's sort of lurking in her family tree. And they start talking about one of the guys, they're having some beers, and one of the guys' father has said to him, you got to be sure your partner has good genes. And Kelly writes about the feeling of a kind of burning sensation of not being able to say anything. What do you say? But, and in her essay, she actually kind of reproduces that dialogue and that conversation and speaks to the fact that, she doesn't see it that way. She can't see it that way. She's got to think about more openness, more hope in the future where maybe there can be a clinical intervention. And there are, in fact. One of our contributors writes about pregenetic diagnosis, which is still in its pioneering days, but it is providing hope for people who, if they discover, and Kelly does not know yet whether or not this is something that she's going to have to deal with. But if she has to, that now there are these possibilities and pioneering kinds of work that can make for a kind of hope. But I think that conversation speaks to the complexity of that sense about kind of shame or stigma. So that, back to your question about what's a kind of surprise about what do people have in common, there's a marked degree across this really wide range of conditions, some of them orphan conditions that are so rare, Fanconi anemia or Fragile X, that are really fairly rare, and others like Alzheimer's that are going to be affecting an enormous percentage of people living in our country and across the globe. So we really kind of range there. I think the other big issue is a kind of, Claire Dunsford describes it as a kind of feistiness or a kind of pushback about, look, we're not defined by this. We are complex human beings, and what we have, to go back to the kind of double-toned title of the memoir I wrote, is so much more than this strand. This strand is important, and it's more important for some of us than for others. But it's by no means the only part of who we are. So there's a sort of very strong sense about wanting to write past that, wanting to live past that, wanting to be more and do more. And yet, there's also a very strong sense. One of the contributors sent me an email this morning, and she said she has lived with cystic fibrosis her whole life, and she just lost her sister actually to cancer. And she writes that one of her pet peeves is when people say, look, everybody has something, and I could be hit by a car tomorrow, and why is it different to have a hereditary condition or to live with a genetic susceptibility for one of these conditions? And she said, it is different. This has shaped every moment of her life. And she said, I don't want to have to keep explaining that to people. She also feels that it's been different in ways that have been profoundly positive, that it's shaped her in ways that have, this has been her life. This has made her, it shaped her career, it shaped her philosophy, it shaped her spiritually. So she's not saying that in a sense of a kind of poor me, but she's saying this in the sense of this truly matters.
You write that disclosure of genetic differences is often quite problematic. I quote, "It is difficult to reveal truths about your genetic status in the light of the anxieties and prohibitions of other family members, some of whom may have strong convictions about the need for privacy." End of quotes. Would you like to elaborate a little on this point?
I'm really glad you asked that, because that's another important strand that connects these writers. So illness happens individually, but it also happens inside of families. Genetic, heritable information happens inside of families in particularly potent ways. So some of our contributors discovered that they have a inherited genetic predisposition, and they were the first to know, and they needed to tell siblings who had children, parents who may or may not have been affected in the same way. Claire Dunsford is very articulate about this in her essay. And for each of us, the issue of writing so I'm writing not just for myself when I write about the BRCA mutation, but when I started working on this project, I was acutely aware of writing on behalf of and for my sisters and their children, but also for my daughters, and also for my partner. So that's something that's come up. One of the questions that one of our contributors has had is, what is this like for the person with whom you live? How does this impact him or her? So there's rebound effects, as Claire Dunsford calls them, and ripples. And in some cases, writers have found that there are portions of the story that they cannot disclose, that they've come to some sort of agreement with family members about what's permissible and what isn't. In other cases, writers feel very strongly that this is my truth, and I need to tell this truth. Emily Rapp, who was just here speaking with my freshman last week, who writes about her son's experience with Tay-Sachs, her feeling is, this is my truth, and I need to write this. But there's been some very, very interesting scholarly work on taking responsibility for writing for others, some of whom have voices and some of whom don't. The dead don't have a voice. Children often don't have a voice. It's a firm belief for me, for people debating this inside of the BRCA community, when you think about at what age do you talk about this with children, at what age should children be tested. BRCA mutations, by and large, breast and ovarian cancers are not pediatric diseases. There are very rare anomalous cases where this is not true, but we have to go with the by and large here. The recommendation that I've been given for the age at which women at high risk for BRCA mutation should be tested is 25. There are people who feel very strongly that it should happen earlier, but these are difficult choices, and the writing about them gets mixed up with advocacy and with clinical decisions, because in a way they all kind of get braided together.
How can the study of narrative be helpful in assessing material that might otherwise be expected to show up in medical or scientific texts?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I'm going to answer that by quoting a filmmaker who's in our collection, Joanna Rudnick, who has made a brilliant documentary film about BRCA mutations, but it could well be, it's a really powerful film for anybody living with an inherited condition or disease. It's called In the Family. And Joanna speaks to the fact that when she was in her 20s and she found out she was positive for the BRCA mutation, she kind of uses a video diary. She follows her own life in her late 20s as she's wrestling with, what do I do about surveillance? Do I think about prophylactic mastectomies and oophorectomies now or in a few years, and how does this impact my relationships? And she was in a relationship at the time, and she actually films her then boyfriend as well as herself. But she quotes a doctor who said at one point, "We never get to hear these conversations." She's thinking about the conversation she has with women and men and family members just before and after women learn that they're positive for the BRCA mutation, and then she follows them. She learns about what they're thinking about months later or when they're facing surgery. In some cases, she interviews a woman who's on her deathbed. And what the doctor says, we never get access to these stories. We never get to hear these stories. We never get to see this stuff. That's something that I think speaks to the importance of putting a human face on these decisions. Many of us felt as we thought, and we all really worked together from the beginning of this collection to conceive of what kind of shape would it have and what kind of essays would we write. And many of us had written before about these issues and are continuing to write about them and feel very strongly that these are not simple matters. We didn't want the narratives to be simple. We don't want the decisions about them to be simple. So when we thought about an audience of potentially clinicians, genetic counselors, family members who are facing these issues, people who are living with these issues themselves, one of the things we hoped was that people would feel less alone, that they might learn information from each other, because things like pregenetic diagnosis, for example, the author, Laurie Strongen, who's worked very hard to be an advocate for pregenetic diagnosis, has worked with people with Fanconi anemia, but other people could learn from that, from other conditions. We wanted to resist the kind of media sound bites that come up when well-intentioned people in the media produce a sensational story. Sometimes it's the kind of what I call the Angelina Jolie effect, and it can be a very useful soundbite. It's not that there isn't something helpful about that. But the sensational story of the 21-year-old having prophylactic mastectomies that's on for 30 seconds and then dismissed, or the story of the 23andMe, do a cheek swab and you know what? You'll know what you have. Well, in fact, A, you may well not know, and B, we all believe that a 1-800 number is not the way to get help and guidance and counseling through what every one of us believes is a profound and life-changing piece of information. Once you learn something, you can't unlearn it. And many of us discover that knowing, the phrase, the word knowing, it's so complex. Yes, I want to know, you say, but then you learn that knowing has ripples and long-term effects. So at the very least, we hope that this can become useful, moving, helpful for other people who will be grappling with this either in a professional way, in a personal way. And, honestly, we believe that that most of us are going to be dealing with these issues either for ourselves or for someone we know well, because as we're learning more and more, we're discovering that more and more complex organic issues do have a kind of heritable strand to them.
What kinds of changes do you see ahead for people facing genetic legacies or diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I'm going to have to say that I think it's going to depend, and it's going to depend on what we mean by the future. One of the things I write about in my essay is that in the case of the breast and ovarian cancers in my family, which we've now known about since my grandmother died of ovarian cancer at 43 and her sister at 45 and my mother's only cousin at 49, and then my mother just a week or two past her 59th birthday, 3 ovarian cancers and 1 breast cancer. It's painful how little has changed in some ways. We're very optimistic, and there are, I'm involved with an organization called Force, and there are very exciting trials that are underway, chemoprevention in younger women who are not yet ready for surgeries. Certainly in the case of BRCA mutations, there is something clinical you can do. I did the surgeries. I'm really glad I did the surgeries. And yet we're also aware of the frustrations, people who follow the tremendous work that's being done in cancer genetics are both really excited by that work and also cautious about thinking about how slowly we have to proceed with our optimism. I mean, obviously, like other people, I, think about the promise of some kinds of gene therapies or ways in which we could go in and edit these kind of broken sentences or phrases in our DNA. But it's hard to know. I think that one of the things Misha Angus has spoken to very powerfully in his essay in the collection is the importance of transparency as a way of crowdsourcing. We need more information from huge numbers of people for research purposes. We need there to be more data, more people willing to participate in clinical trials, more disclosure, less stigma, less secrecy. So that's another way in which I think that sharing stories, yes, but also sharing data and trying to help as much as possible to advance progress in this. I hope very much for my daughters, who are again, so they're 19 and 21 now, I hope that there will be an array of choices available to them that were not available to me. But I am also aware that there were choices available for me that were not available for my mother. So though I'm guarded, I'm not, I don't think I'm a kind of naive optimist about what's coming. I am also aware that there has been real significant progress and will continue to be.
What do you hope readers might take away from this collection? And a related question, do you hope that this text might be used in a course in, say, medical ethics, medical humanities, genetic counselling?
So to the second question, which kind of ties in a bit to the first, there is an educational component for all of us, again, whether we're those of us in the collection who are kind of full-time academics as I am, but I think all of us feel, and actually one of the reasons that we were really gratified to have this collection coming out from Hopkins, a press that is, really has outreach into classroom adoption. We do very much want this to become a kind of teaching tool. We're aware that the science is changing minute by minute, but these narratives have, we think, a long shelf life because they're about decades of living with complicated issues and materials and decisions and fallout that we think will not go away. I mean, I could see these being, and I really hope that these will be meaningful a year from now and 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, as people are sort of trying to understand, well, what has this felt like? And some of these are kind of larger human condition questions that we don't see as being altered by, the sort of magic moment in which all of these things are, unless we can magically fix all of this, which I think will, alas, will not be happening anytime too soon. I think in the classroom, one of the things that's been very important to me across a range of subjects that I teach is what we talk about in literature is kind of teaching the debate. And that is to say, and it's one of the things that I really hope that people who are either actively involved in education or who are the kind of lay readers who are interested in this material and moved by it for different reasons, is recognizing that these are conversations. In this book, there's no template of kind of do this, do that. That was the thing that we wanted to resist. We wanted conversation, and I think we want debate. Lively, dynamic, at times heated debate Yeah, there are moments of consensus, but there are moments of really active disagreement. Some people feel that if you have a known, and some of the writers feel, if you have a known significant hereditary condition, you shouldn't have children. Other people feel, and I'm one of them, that I can't imagine not having had my daughters. They've been one of the most important parts of my life. So, there's debate there. There's debate about the limits of transparency and disclosure. There's debate about privacy. Does it exist? Can it exist? What does it mean? There's a real debate about intervention. There's a debate about finding out. Do you really want to know, and how much are you going to let that shape you? We want those debates. If I have a hope for the collection, we want those debates to happen on the national and frankly on the global level where they need to be happening. As far as the kind of ethical, back to the question about what can narrative contribute, so the ethical questions get couched in narrative. That's how we know and experience each other's lives, is through narrative. And the questions that get asked, the really hard questions, are not things that can be ticked off in a box with a yes, no. They're questions that have to happen through the conversations that we're having together. So many of us, I think, in this collection believe that we're the kind of canaries in the coal mine, because these are points of illumination that are going to grow brighter in the coming years. And to the extent that we can pose questions, begin to have conversations together as a community of people who are coming from very different communities, we believe that it's important to be starting this, and we very much feel that the collection is the beginning of a conversation that we hope will widen and get taken up by other voices.
Amy, let's conclude with your own research. You're a professor of English literature. Special focus is British literature of the 17th century. Are you going to return to that particular area, or will you continue your research on genetics and narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I teach in two areas, 17th century British and also in creative nonfiction and memoir writing and essay writing. But my new project, as I'm conceiving of it now, and it's very early days, actually will have its roots in the early modern. I've become really interested in the larger question of narratives about heritability. How have those narratives been shaped? And I'm interested in that across a kind of wide time span, from the early modern period actually to the present. And I'm in this new project, I'm thinking about a series of linked essays, starting with the early modern, in which I look at the idea of display and showing, which I think is, or exposure, which I think is that's a narrative element that happens for many of us. What do you display? What do you put on display, and how? And so in that first essay, I'm looking at Montaigne and Bacon and Ambroise Paré and the kind of origins of the case. And I'm thinking about the case both as a visual case in terms of early modern museums, Kunstkammer and Wunderkammer, and the idea of display, but also case histories, narrative cases. And so Ambroise Paré wrote in his Of Monsters and Marvels. He was a French surgeon, 16th century, and he wrote what was really the first kind of work on birth defects or heritable defects. And I'm really interested in the kind of narrative idea of the defect. Where does it come from? How does it get displayed? How does it get looked at? So I'm starting there, and then I'm interested in categories and placing in the 18th century, looking at Linnaeus, and then actually in numeration and quantifying heritable difference and the rise of statistics in the 19th century. Again, this is very kind of early, and I'm just beginning this. And then in the 20th century, I'm particularly interested in the idea of the deletion, what gets left out. And then in the last essay, looking at the narrative act of deleting, and in what's, I think, the darkest chapter in kind of the history of eugenics is thinking about, in the history of genetics, is thinking about eugenics and what does it mean when we try to leave out what is defective, and which I think is a particularly dangerous but also really fascinating part of the historical period to look at.